The infrared drone passes overhead at 300 feet, its thermal imaging system scanning the frozen February landscape in methodical grid patterns. And beneath the snow-covered soil of what appears to be an abandoned rural property, 17,000 pounds of preserved food, water filtration systems, medical supplies, and emergency equipment rest in complete thermal invisibility, undetectable to the most sophisticated surveillance technology currently deployed by federal agencies, private security contractors, in the increasingly aggressive regulatory frameworks that now govern stockpiling behavior in 12 states. This invisible preparation exists not through science fiction or elaborate deception, but through the precise application of thermodynamic principles, geological knowledge, material science, and the calculated exploitation of detection system limitations that most preppers never study and that government agencies assume civilians cannot understand. The difference between a stockpile that survives confiscation, legal seizure, opportunistic theft, or community panic versus one that becomes a target within 72 hours of social collapse hinges entirely on understanding what detection systems actually measure, how human search patterns operate under stress, and why the traditional basement storage model represents one of the most catastrophically vulnerable approaches to long-term resource security ever conceived by the preparedness community. The fundamental error embedded in conventional stockpiling methodology stems from a complete misunderstanding of how resources become compromised during acute crisis periods, and this misunderstanding kills more preparation strategies than any single environmental or social factor. Most individuals approach stockpiling as a simple accumulation problem, focusing exclusively on quantity, rotation schedules, and container durability, while entirely ignoring the detection surface their storage creates and the predictable human behaviors that transform neighbors, officials, and desperate strangers into systematic searchers within hours of supply chain interruption. When grocery stores empty during the initial 36 hours of crisis escalation, the immediate response among unprepared populations follows an extremely predictable pattern that has been documented across every modern supply disruption, from Hurricane Katrina to the COVID-19 panic buying waves to the Texas power grid failure of 2021. First comes the retail rush, then the rapid depletion of commercial inventory, followed by a brief period of shocked paralysis, and finally, the transition into active resource-seeking behavior that begins with requests, escalates to demands, and terminates in forced entry and systematic searching of properties believed to contain supplies. The critical element that determines whether your stockpile survives this transition phase is not the strength of your locks or the caliber of your defensive firearms, but whether anyone knows or suspects that resources exist on your property in the first place. And this is where traditional storage locations betray preppers with mathematical certainty. Basements, garages, spare bedrooms, and storage sheds all share a common fatal characteristic that make them completely unsuitable for serious long-term stockpiling, despite their popularity in preparedness literature. And that characteristic is their integration into the normal search pattern that humans instinctively follow when looking for stored resources. When individuals search a property for food, water, or supplies, they begin with the locations where they personally would store such items, which means they check basements first, because basements are cool, dark, and traditionally associated with storage in American residential architecture. They check garages second, because garages contain visible shelving and storage containers. They check kitchen pantries, closets, and any room with a closed door. This search pattern is not random or chaotic. It follows a cognitive map built from cultural norms and personal experience, which means it is entirely predictable and therefore entirely exploitable if you understand how to position resources outside these instinctive search zones. The truly invisible stockpile does not hide behind a locked door or underneath a tarp, because locks indicate valuable contents and tarps indicate something worth covering. The truly invisible stockpile occupies space that searchers do not conceptualize as storage space, locations that fall outside the mental category of places where supplies could be kept. And this requires understanding the specific cognitive blind spots that govern human search behavior under time pressure and stress. The most sophisticated approach to stealth stockpiling exploits the single largest perceptual blind spot in human searching behavior, which is the failure to recognize that substantial storage volume exists below the frost line in underground installations that require no permanent structure, generate no thermal signature, and remain completely invisible to casual observation, official inspection, and even determined searching unless the searcher possesses specific knowledge of the installation's precise location. Underground cache systems, properly designed and installed, create what intelligence agencies call denial of knowledge scenarios, where even aggressive interrogation or prolonged surveillance cannot reveal resource locations because no visible indicators exist above ground. No access points interrupt the landscape's natural appearance, and no thermal or electromagnetic signatures distinguish the cache site from surrounding terrain. The engineering principles that enable this level of concealment are not classified or exotic. They derive directly from military cache doctrine developed during the Cold War, archaeological preservation techniques used to protect artifacts in unstable regions, and the thermodynamic properties of soil as an insulating medium. A cache installed at a depth of 4 feet below grade in properly drained soil maintains an essentially constant temperature between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of surface conditions, experiences no freeze-thaw cycling that damages containers, and produces absolutely no thermal differential detectable by infrared systems because the surrounding soil mass acts as a perfect thermal buffer that equilibrates temperature across the entire underground volume. The technical requirements for constructing an undetectable underground cache system begin with understanding soil mechanics, drainage patterns, and the specific failure modes that cause most amateur installations to either flood, collapse, or become visible through surface subsidence. The fatal error in amateur cache construction is inadequate drainage planning, which results in water infiltration that destroys stored materials, creates surface depressions as soil settles, and in extreme cases produces visible water pooling that marks the cache location as clearly as a neon sign. Professional cache installation requires first identifying locations where natural drainage moves water away from the installation site, which typically means elevated positions on gentle slopes where gravity naturally channels groundwater downslope and away from the cache chamber. The ideal installation site sits 10 to 15 feet below the local ridgeline to avoid making the cache the highest point in the immediate area, while maintaining positive drainage in all directions. Soil composition matters enormously because clay-heavy soils retain water and expand during freeze-thaw cycles, creating pressure that crushes containers and forces cache chambers upward toward the surface, while sandy or loamy soils provide excellent drainage and minimal expansion forces, but require more sophisticated structural support to prevent collapse. The excavation itself must be executed with tactical discipline because the single most common error that exposes amateur caches is visible spoil disposal, where freshly excavated soil left in mounds near the installation site creates an obvious marker that remains visible for years as vegetation patterns differ between native and disturbed soil. The concealment of excavation spoil requires distributing removed soil across a wide area in thin layers no more than 2 inches deep, preferably during autumn when leaf fall naturally covers disturbed ground, or incorporating the spoil into existing landscaping projects, garden bed construction, or drainage improvements that provide legitimate cover for soil movement. The cache chamber itself demands materials that resist both crushing pressure from soil weight and chemical degradation from groundwater contact, which eliminates wooden structures entirely due to rot and insect damage, rules out most metal containers due to corrosion, and leaves only specific polymers and concrete as viable construction materials. High-density polyethylene tanks designed for septic or water storage applications provide excellent cache chambers because they resist chemical degradation, handle soil loading pressures up to several thousand pounds per square foot, and remain completely stable in underground installations for decades. A 48-inch diameter polyethylene tank buried at 4-foot depth provides nearly 40 cubic feet of storage volume, sufficient for several months of supplies for a small family, while presenting absolutely no surface signature if properly installed. The critical installation detail involves backfilling around the chamber with gravel rather than native soil, creating a drainage envelope that channels water away from the tank surface and prevents soil-to-container contact that could transmit chemical contamination or allow root penetration over time. Access to underground caches represents the most technically challenging aspect of stealth stockpiling because any permanent access point creates a surface feature that observant searchers can identify, while temporary access methods must be sufficiently disguised to pass unnoticed during casual observation, yet remain usable during emergency retrieval when time pressure and stress degrade cognitive function and physical capability. The standard solution developed by military cache specialists involves creating access points that appear to be naturally occurring landscape features or elements so common that they trigger no investigative interest. A large landscape boulder placed directly over the cache access port provides excellent concealment because boulders are visually inert features that observers instinctively categorize as immovable and therefore not worth investigating. The boulder must be genuine glacial stone native to the local geology, rather than decorative imported stone that would appear incongruous, and it must be positioned during cache installation so that rolling or tilting the boulder exposes the access port underneath without requiring excavation. The physics of boulder movement are counterintuitive because even stones weighing several hundred pounds can be repositioned by a single individual using leverage principles, specifically by using a steel pry bar as a Class 1 lever with a fulcrum point placed close to the boulder's edge. A 4-foot pry bar with a fulcrum 18 inches from the boulder edge generates mechanical advantage sufficient to lift and roll a 400-pound stone, and this same technique reverses to re-secure the access point after retrieval operations. Alternative concealment methods for cache access points include existing landscape features, such as established ornamental plantings, particularly large shrubs or small ornamental trees planted in raised beds where the root ball naturally elevates the planting above grade level and provides cover for access ports located at the original soil surface beneath the raised planting area. This approach works exceptionally well with evergreen shrubs that maintain visual screening year-round and possess root systems shallow enough to avoid interfering with cache chambers located 3 to 4 feet below grade. The tactical advantage of vegetation concealment is that it transforms cache access into a routine maintenance activity. Anyone observing you working around established landscape plantings interprets the activity as normal yard work rather than resource retrieval, and this perceptual camouflage remains effective even during crisis periods when neighbors are actively watching for suspicious behavior. The installation sequence requires planting the shrubs simultaneously with cache installation, allowing roots to establish naturally around the access point over a period of years, creating a genuinely established appearance that cannot be replicated through rushed installation during a crisis period when surveillance pressure is highest. The internal organization of cache storage requires understanding how different supply categories degrade over time and how container failure modes can cascade through stored materials, destroying entire cache contents through a single failure point. Food storage in underground caches demands vapor barrier containers capable of maintaining internal atmosphere independent of external humidity, because even minor moisture infiltration triggers oxidation reactions that destroy nutritional value and create conditions for bacterial and fungal growth. Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers provide the gold standard for long-term food preservation because they create a hermetic seal that arrests oxidation completely, But these bags require secondary protection from mechanical damage and must be stored in rigid containers that prevent punctures from soil settling or container shifting. 5-gallon food-grade polyethylene buckets with Gamma Seal lids create an effective secondary barrier that protects Mylar-packaged foods while allowing individual bucket retrieval without exposing entire cache contents to humidity during access operations. Water storage in caches presents unique challenges because water's weight creates enormous pressure at container bases, requiring structurally robust storage that most preppers underestimate. 7-gallon water storage containers stacked more than 2 units high begin experiencing stress fractures at bottom container bases due to weight loading, and these fractures propagate slowly over months or years until catastrophic failure occurs, typically dumping 30 to 50 gallons across the cache interior and destroying any materials not protected by waterproof secondary packaging. Medical supplies cached underground must be selected based on temperature stability across the 45 to 55 degree range that underground installations naturally maintain, which eliminates most antibiotics, insulin, and biological medications that require strict temperature control, but preserves the efficacy of most over-the-counter medications, topical antibiotics, and emergency trauma supplies indefinitely. The critical detail involves protecting medications from humidity rather than temperature extremation, because moisture infiltration causes tablet dissolution, powder clumping, and chemical degradation far more rapidly than temperature cycling. Vacuum-sealed packaging provides excellent protection, but the vacuum seal must be verified annually because seals fail over time through microscopic polymer degradation and mechanical stress from handling. The verification process requires bringing a test sample to surface level periodically without exposing the entire cache inventory, which means organizing cache contents with expendable test items positioned near access points, where they can be retrieved and inspected without disturbing deeper storage layers. This inspection discipline separates amateur caching from professional-grade installations because amateurs assume that sealed containers remain sealed indefinitely, while professionals understand that all seals fail eventually and that detection of early failure prevents total loss. The most sophisticated element of stealth stockpiling involves creating multiple cache sites with different security profiles, storage durations, and access requirements, effectively building a tiered system where the most critical supplies rest in the most secure installations, while frequently accessed items occupy more convenient but slightly less concealed locations. This distributed architecture prevents the catastrophic total loss scenario, where discovery or destruction of a single cache eliminates all stored resources simultaneously. And it creates operational flexibility during crisis periods when circumstances may make certain cache sites inaccessible while others remain available. A properly designed multi-cache system typically includes a primary deep cache holding core survival supplies intended to remain undisturbed for years, a secondary cache containing commonly needed items with 6 to 12-month rotation cycles, and tertiary caches positioned for rapid emergency access, even under hostile conditions. The primary cache installation follows all concealment protocols previously described, with maximum emphasis on invisibility and long-term structural integrity. Secondary caches may accept slightly higher visibility in exchange for easier access, perhaps using locations on your own property that are private but not necessarily invisible to family members or trusted associates who share your preparedness philosophy. Tertiary caches demand prioritization of rapid access above all other considerations and should be positioned within easy reach of defensive positions, safe rooms, or evacuation routes, even if this positioning increases detection risk. The geographic distribution of cache sites introduces strategic considerations that most preppers completely ignore, specifically the catastrophic vulnerability created by concentrating all resources on a single property that could become inaccessible through legal seizure, natural disaster, or hostile control by organized looters. Professional intelligence doctrine for denied area operations specifies that critical resources must be cached at multiple non-contiguous locations separated by sufficient distance that a single incident cannot compromise multiple sites simultaneously, typically meaning installations at least 2 miles apart and ideally separated by significant terrain features such as waterways, highways, or ridgelines that serve as natural operational boundaries. For civilian preppers, this principle translates into identifying trusted rural properties belonging to family members or close associates where you can install caches with permission, or in extreme cases, acquiring small parcels of undeveloped land specifically for cache installation. The financial investment in a 5-acre wooded parcel in a rural area with private road access often costs less than the value of supplies most serious preppers accumulate, and such property provides essentially unlimited cache installation opportunities while remaining far enough from your primary residence that no single crisis event can deny access to both locations simultaneously. The operational security considerations surrounding multi-site caching cannot be overstated because the human factor represents the weakest element in any security system, and the knowledge that someone possesses substantial hidden resources creates overwhelming temptation during genuine crisis periods when moral constraints collapse under survival pressure. The iron rule of cache security dictates that the smallest possible number of individuals should possess knowledge of cache locations, and ideally, no individual except yourself should know the locations of all installations in your network. If your spouse or partner requires cache access capability for redundancy, consider dividing knowledge so that each person knows different cache locations, providing backup access without creating a single point of catastrophic information compromise. Written records of cache locations represent an enormous security vulnerability and should be avoided entirely in favor of memorized coordinates referenced to permanent terrain features that cannot be moved or destroyed. If written records are absolutely necessary for backup purposes, they must be encrypted using methods that resist both casual discovery and professional cryptanalysis, stored separately from any materials that could identify them as cache-related documentation, and protected by cover stories that explain their existence if discovered during property search operations. The timing of cache installation carries strategic implications that most preppers fail to consider until circumstances make installation impossible or suicidally dangerous. Underground cache construction requires substantial excavation that generates noise, visible activity, and soil disturbance that cannot be concealed during execution, only after completion once vegetation and weathering have restored natural appearance. This means that cache installation must occur during periods of social stability when unusual property activity attracts no particular attention, and when you can execute the work methodically without time pressure or security concerns. The worst possible moment to begin cache installation is during the early stages of a developing crisis when community awareness is heightened, neighbors are watching each other suspiciously, and any unusual activity triggers investigation. Preppers who delay cache installation until they perceive crisis indicators have already missed the operational window, and they face the choice between executing installation under adverse observation conditions or abandoning the strategy entirely. The professional approach involves treating cache installation as a long-term project executed during optimal conditions years before any specific crisis threat emerges, building infrastructure during peaceful periods that will provide critical advantage when circumstances deteriorate. The environmental factors that govern cache longevity and preservation quality extend far beyond simple temperature control and include complex interactions between soil chemistry, groundwater patterns, seismic activity, and biological intrusion from burrowing animals and root systems. Acidic soils, common in areas with high pine tree density, accelerate corrosion of any metal components in cache installations and can even degrade certain polymers over multi-decade timeframes, requiring material selection that accounts for local soil pH levels and the use of sacrificial barrier layers that absorb chemical attack before it reaches critical containers. Groundwater tables fluctuate seasonally and can rise dramatically during wet years, potentially submerging caches that remain dry for years and creating flooding conditions that overwhelm drainage systems designed for normal precipitation patterns. This vulnerability demands installing caches with substantial elevation margin above the historically highest water table recorded for the area, which requires researching local hydrological data and consulting with old-time residents who remember extreme flooding events that may not appear in official records. Seismic considerations matter even in supposedly stable continental interior regions, because minor earthquakes occurring once or twice per century can shift soil layers, crack concrete structures, and create water infiltration paths that compromise cache integrity decades after installation. The biological threats to underground caches include burrowing mammals such as groundhogs, badgers, and foxes that excavate den systems capable of penetrating several feet below grade and intersecting cache chambers, creating access holes that allow water infiltration and potentially exposing stored materials to surface observation. Tree root systems present an even more insidious threat because major roots from large trees can penetrate 6 to 8 feet deep while spreading laterally 30 feet or more from the trunk. And these roots exert enormous pressure as they grow, sufficient to crack concrete and distort metal containers over periods of years. The strategic solution involves positioning caches in areas deliberately cleared of large trees, with root prevention barriers installed along cache perimeter edges to deflect any roots that do attempt penetration. The barriers themselves can be simple HDPE sheets buried vertically along cache boundaries, creating an impenetrable membrane that forces roots to route around rather than through the protected zone. Animal intrusion prevention requires more active measures, specifically maintaining clear sight lines around cache locations that allow you to observe and eliminate any burrows beginning to develop near installations before they reach critical depth. This monitoring discipline separates functional caches from failed installations because unmonitored caches inevitably suffer biological compromise over sufficient time periods, while actively managed installations can remain viable for decades. The legal landscape surrounding stockpiling has evolved dramatically over the past 15 years, as local, state, and federal authorities have implemented increasingly aggressive regulatory frameworks that criminalize or severely restrict the accumulation of certain categories of supplies, particularly in the aftermath of events where stockpiled materials were used in violent attacks, or when hoarders were blamed for exacerbating shortages during crisis periods. At least 12 states have implemented reporting requirements for bulk purchases of long-term storage food exceeding certain quantity thresholds, and several jurisdictions have given code enforcement officers authority to inspect properties for compliance with regulations limiting the quantity of stored materials in residential structures. These regulations typically cite fire safety concerns and use commercial storage facility standards as justification, but their practical effect is to create legal exposure for serious preppers whose stockpiles necessarily exceed the arbitrary limits established by bureaucrats with no understanding of actual preparedness requirements. The stealth cache approach completely sidesteps this regulatory framework because inspectors can only regulate what they can observe, and properly concealed underground installations simply do not appear during even aggressive property inspections. The legal theory supporting this position holds that items stored on your property in locations not visible during normal inspection processes remain private property exempt from regulatory oversight, provided the items themselves are legal to possess and the storage method does not create genuine safety hazards. The ultimate strategic value of stealth stockpiling emerges during the critical transition period between initial crisis onset and the eventual establishment of either restored order or a new equilibrium state, because this transition period is when resource availability determines survival outcomes and when visible stockpiles become targets regardless of defensive preparations. History demonstrates repeatedly across dozens of modern collapse scenarios that the families who survive extended crisis periods with nutrition, health, and dignity intact are those who possessed resources that others did not know existed, not those who possess the most firepower or the strongest defensive positions. Ammunition expires, defensive positions can be bypassed or burned, and even the most prepared fighters eventually lose to superior numbers or simple exhaustion. But resources hidden where desperate people cannot find them remain available indefinitely, providing sustenance and security that no amount of weapons can deliver. This is the fundamental truth that separates genuine survival strategy from tactical fantasy, and it is why the invisible stockpile represents the single most important preparedness investment you can make. More critical than weapons, more valuable than skills, more decisive than any other factor when genuine long-term crisis tests your preparation against reality.